We got the right you, right?
I was saying when I went to Berkeley to give a talk several years ago, there's an artist with my name, who's much hipper looking than I am, and her picture was on my poster for my talk.
That's amazing.
This is Delta checking in.
Thank you, Delta. Can you see and hear us okay?
Yes, we can.
Which campus is that? Or is this broadcasting to all the?
I believe the way it works is we have to advertise, and then if they want to opt in, they have to let us know.
Okay.
But I'm not. Is that how it works?
Yes. So they're set up sites that the call's been connected to, so anyone who comes to those sites will be able to see what's going on right now.
Yeah. Right. But we have to set up the.
Everything is set up okay?
I think so.
Hey. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Tara, this is another one of our organizers, Dory.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
It's great to meet you.
Thank you.
What were you saying?
Yeah, so I just.
I was going to ask, can I just do the piece right after? I don't know the next time I'll be on campus.
Oh, yeah. So, who do I need to give it to? Make sure I get my full
Jen
back.
Hymas in Chas office.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Is that all right?
I'll just do it tomorrow night.
Otherwise, I can mail it from home.
So we
We'll just
normally
take a couple of
turn
days that way.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. So,
Okay.
speaking
So I'll get back to you
in
after
hear
that.
them. Okay.
Go ahead
And I will
turn this
start it with my.
is Nephi. Are you able to see and hear us?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
goodness.
That's our mics.
Can you hear us? This is the Price campus. We can't hear you.
Sounds like they can hear us. Yeah.
That's good.
Okay.
We'll just
Can you
swap.
hear us now? Okay,
Yep, we
thank
can
you.
hear you.
So that might just hold. There we go. There are always technical difficulties. So now we're back. Now can you hear? Welcome from the Price campus. We're happy to have you here. So, once upon a time, like way back in the 1990s, probably before a lot of you were born, right? I was at least in part a Southern Studies scholar, which is not so much what I do these days so much. I'm really looking at how certain ideas about the U.S. South, how it functioned as a region, were really part and parcel with how America imagined itself. And at that time, I went into what, back in the 90s, we called cyberspace, right? That's what we called online places. And was really, as part of the research on the South, interested in a group of primarily white men who gathered in cyberspace to continue to kind of wax nostalgic about having lost the Civil War. They called themselves neo-Confederates. That research is now over 15 years old. I, kind of abandoned in many ways the work that I did on the South. Nobody in LA cared, right? And instead, I've, been busy doing a lot of other work in digital media, including running a lab that produces software. But as the novelist William Faulkner reminded us, the past is never really past. It comes back and haunts us in ways we might not expect. And as I watched the TV coverage of the removal of Confederate monuments in New Orleans a few years ago, something that, I think many people like myself who grew up in the South thought might never happen, right? Even though many of us, including white folks, hoped that they would come down. And soon after that removal, the invasion of Charlottesville, Virginia, by a variety of far-right groups, my scholarly past really started to catch up with me, right? I felt like I was being returned in a different way to research I had done in the past and things I thought I should go back and think about again. Because in the 1990s, when I looked at this group of neo-Confederates online, I thought they were a curious oddity. They were pretty isolated on the internet of the late 1990s. The internet then was not organized through platforms like Facebook and YouTube and was instead kind of wide open. And it would be very hard for anybody to have found the guys back then if they didn't know they were looking for them, right? So they seemed like a group that would sort of maybe wither away and not rise again into prominence. And while I think the way I described the group and what motivated them in the 1990s was correct, I was very wrong about them withering away. They have decidedly not withered away. And as I go back and look at that and think about how a certain trajectory around their goals coincided with the rise of what we might call the platformed internet, the internet sort of past Web 2.0, the internet we inhabit today, I see the ways that shifting notions of race in the U.S. and in the public discourse and different ways of operating online that are very different than 1998 have really come together. They exist in a kind of feedback loop that propel each other. So the neo-Confederates resurface for me over the debates about Confederate monument removal, which were pretty animated 2 years ago as the New Orleans City Council moved to take down Confederate monuments that were part of the city, and then really kind of picked up steam in the move toward Charlottesville. In this footage, I think, is that we're going to look at really quickly. It's fairly typical of the coverage around the removal of the monuments that happened in places like television.
Adriana, a controversial topic that looks like it will come to an end sometime later this month. The mayor and City Hall want monuments like this one at Lee Circle taken down, but other people say they should stay up. So that kind of notion, one group wants this, one group wants that, a kind of equivalency is set up. That was very typical. Signatures of support in hand, the group Monumental Task Committee says the mayor and City Hall are way off base in their efforts to remove 4 Confederate-era monuments.
We stand united in opposition to this proposal. The Monumental Task Committee has recently been drawn, like all of you, into this controversy surrounding the removal of 4 monuments.
Over the summer, the mayor announced that he wants monuments at Lee Circle and of Jeff Davis, PGT Beauregard, and of the Battle of Liberty Place taken down, citing their public nuisances. The council will debate the matter during a special hearing this Thursday and vote on the issue next week, December 17th. And this group has some serious questions about the process.
We also question whether this entire process is legal. Does the city actually own the monuments, and does it have permission to take them down and store them?
But other organizations say, tear them down.
We and Take Them Down NOLA, of course, will not be satisfied unless all of the statues are taken down.
If the council votes to remove the monuments, they could be gone by year's end. And while City Hall isn't saying what will happen to them, the options are relocation of the monuments to an appropriate indoor facility, such as a museum, but it also allows for their storage, donation, or disposal.
I consider them to be debris, and so they can go to the trash pile as far as I'm concerned.
So that kind of TV coverage is fairly predictable. It creates a kind of equivalency between the two different sides and how we might understand them. And that coverage continued in a lot of the way we would think about removing the monuments. So there was a kind of tension between those who wanted to preserve history, often a history that was a very white Southern history, and those who didn't. This is from one of the rallies. This image might seem a little confusing to you, right? But the woman on your right is a woman named Arlene Barnum, who sided with the Confederates to keep the monuments. And so she was frequently featured in the newscast as a kind of complicating figure. So the young gentleman with the sign is not taken in by, kind of Arlene Barnum and has a different sensibility. So really the newscasts portray a kind of moral equivalency. And the force of the coverage stages the two sides as locked into different worldviews, but worldviews that are separate but more or less equal. And we're really capable of holding that kind of moral equivalency given the way Americans' production of race and racism has shifted after the Civil War. So after the Civil War, we moved to a kind of representation of racism that typically tries to hold black and white apart. From the Civil Rights Movement till well into the 21st century, certain kinds of overt racial discourse, overt racism would have been impolite, impolitic, not permitted, right? They wouldn't have been a kind of dominant way of speaking about race. I mean, that is not to say that racism wasn't still operative in the second half of the century, of the 20th century, but the way that we represented or understood race tend to go to more covert mechanisms rather than explicit or overt racism. And that logic of equivalency is part and parcel of that process, that these are just two different sides, and we're not going to think about how the sides are related, or if you could actually believe both of those things in a rational way at the same time. So in many ways the New Orleans coverage unfolded was very predictable and adhered to patterns that I'd analyzed in my book in the past about the representations of the South. But what I've been interested in the emergence of new ways of representing race in the 21st century that begin before this Confederate monument scandal, and in many ways I think are an organized reaction to the success of an African-American president on the national stage, are a new expression of race and racism in America that returns us to some of those more overt forms of expression. So the British cultural theorist Raymond Williams wrote in the past about an idea he calls an emergent structure of feeling. And he says that an emergent structure of feeling is a kind of emotional register, a cultural sensibility that's trying to take hold at a given moment. It's not the dominant mode, but it's a mode that's struggling to be perceived and to come into dominance in a cultural paradigm. And in the 1990s or the early 2000s, I think the dominant idea for expressing racist ideas was that expressing overtly racist ideas in public was unacceptable, that it was inappropriate. Even if policies and incarceration and school systems still supported racist structures, the overt expression of racism was frowned upon. So racism existed, but its expression was curtailed. However, at the same time, since the early 2000s, I'd say lots of other ideas and ways of thinking about race have been competing for dominance in an American framework. So Williams would have called these emergent structures of feeling, ways of thinking, modes of feeling that are really kind of emerging at a particular time. So I want to share some of those and their expression with you. And not surprisingly, these modes are not taking place on broadcast television, right? But on platforms, networks like YouTube. So I was going to show you this video. This is a guy, Jason Kessler, who helped plan the Charlottesville rally, who's not a Southerner. But in the time since last week, YouTube has taken this video down. And later we could talk a little bit about why some videos persist for years on YouTube and some don't, why YouTube changes mind about certain things. But I've plugged in a different video that's quite similar for us to look at for a minute.
I got one question.
Let me go a little bit forward. So this is around the same controversy, which leading up to Charlottesville helped mobilize the far right.
Like a pussy, just folding up this flag of no backbone because you don't want to be fired. I mean, really, is that what it comes down to? And there goes your people, there goes your culture, there goes your history, just out with a whimper.
Well, as James pointed out, there's some of us that still have that Confederate blood flowing in our veins, and we know it, and we know what we're going to have to do eventually, and we, by God's grace, will do it.
Well, and Lana, to jump in on what you just said, but first to go back, yes, slavery was not a unique institution of the South, as everyone knows. Every race has endured slavery, and every race has practiced slavery. Now, what you're talking about with the people who won't stand up now, if you don't stand up and defend your family's name and honor, you are no man at all. Even if I wasn't engaged politically to the extent that I am, I would hope in my heart that if someone was destroying the grave of one of my ancestors, something in me would stand up and fight back about that. And that's exactly what is happening throughout the South. And it's not going to stop here. But if you don't stand up, to me, to be directly descended from people who took up arms and fought, white men that actually did something, that is one of the greatest genetic inheritances that I could have possibly received. And how could you not stand up and do something to defend these people. But it's not going to stop with the South. You already see these chronic black malcontents, these Marxists, these degenerates. They're already going. Andrew
That
Jackson,
would be me, the
George
degenerates.
Washington. It doesn't stop here.
Coming for the Yankees next.
Yeah.
Yes. And who's going to defend them? Now,
Yeah.
you actually see Northerners are going to go up and defend. Well, George Washington was a Southerner anyway. I'm trying to think of a legitimate Northern hero that was born in a Northern state. I mean, George Washington was a Virginian. I mean, who's going to defend these people?
Good luck, James.
Yeah, and I keep hearing, oh, well, we have to end white supremacy. It's over now. It's like white people built this country. You can't just act like white men didn't build this country. It's undeniably a white country built by white people for white people. But to them, white supremacy, when you hear them, we think of it as being like, oh, some white man dominating over some black man with a whip. No, in their view, white supremacy starting to feel like it's just white people existing in their own countries. And
Okay, so this is fairly typical of the coverage that is prominent on YouTube in a variety of ways that Jason Kessler is also part and parcel of. In the video that's come down, he, much like the first gentleman we hear in the clip I played, hear him call patriots to come armed to New Orleans. He reminds everyone that Louisiana is an open carry state, so you should show up with your weapons and be there to defend the statue, because if we don't defend that heritage now, we may lose the chance to do so. And that sensibility really continues as they move into the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in August of 2017. And that event, as you probably know, became one of the largest gatherings of the far right, ending in the death of a leftist activist and in a violent confrontation in the streets of Charlottesville. Kessler notes in the video that's come down, that he had been, though he's not a Southerner, corresponding with various Southern organizations to think about how he might cooperate with them and mobilize more of the country around the monuments that were coming down. And one group that he talks about is the League of the South, which one of the gentlemen in the video we did watch is part of. Their founder is a former history professor named Michael Hill, and he's someone I have been tracking, asked. Okay, I don't know. The screen's there for now, so we'll keep it. You get a sneak preview if you're bored. This is Michael Hill in the box in the New York Times article. He now calls himself a white nationalist. And honestly, I thought he was dead, right? I had written about him in the 90s. You know, at the time, he seemed pretty old to me. So I was surprised that he reappeared with such force on the national scene, really mobilizing a diverse group of far-right actors in different ways over the course of the spring, summer, and fall of 2017. And, you know, here he is actually marching in Charlottesville in images that he showed on his Twitter account. He goes on to kind of talk about the things that are happening in New Orleans on the website of the League of the South, which, you know, you see here is organized as about the survival, well-being, and independence of the Southern people. An elision, of course, that assumes that the Southern people are white people, right? Because the organization is not particularly concerned about other Southerners who are not white, which are, you know, a very large percentage of the South itself. So on the one hand, in a series of articles like this, New Orleans is a city houses the cherished monuments that the League of the South and their ilk are trying to defend. He waxes poetic about how the League of the South volunteers stood like Southern warriors to defend the monuments and in defense of our people. But on the other hand, he attacks New Orleans and understands New Orleans to have become a kind of degenerate space. It's a city that's no longer a majority white space, like many cities in the South, as whites have fled to the suburbs. And he sees it as, you know, a space that's really become sort of unruly and he goes on to kind of argue that really whites are at threat in the South, that he says, as blacks and other minorities, especially Hispanics in the American Southwest, have gained political control over towns and cities, the decline in the quality of life for whites has been precipitous. There's no evidence of that, but it's a kind of repeated assertion. So New Orleans really becomes a kind of battleground, not only for Hall, but for Kessler and for many others, as a place where a kind of perceived attack on whiteness could really be located, and that locating that attack could help generate a new audience, a new way to kind of fuel the ranks of white supremacy. But this is not just the racism of, the 1940s or of the 1990s, but a different emergent form of racism that takes on different contours. I hadn't really totally lost sight of Michael Hill over 2 decades, but I was surprised by how much his appearance in Charlottesville really connected him to fascist groups, to far-right groups, to the National Front, and to groups that had a very avowed expression of neo-Nazi ideas. When I first wrote about Hill and his neo-Confederates in the 90s and early 2000s, first for a collection on race in cyberspace, and later for my book, Reconstructing Dixie, their websites were more of this order. Like if you're 19, you probably never saw websites that looked like this. But I'll tell you a secret. You could go to the Wayback Machine, which is the Internet Archive, and look at what the web used to look like, right? And it used to look like this. And believe me, we thought this was super fancy when it looked like this, right? It was very cool, right? So the League of the South was part of this group called DixieNet. And the reason it was organized as DixieNet was that you could go to one site and it would link you to another site to try to direct you, right? To try to help you move from one place to the next. Because the web in the late 1990s was a kind of wild and unruled place where it was actually kind of hard to find your way around, right? Now think, are any of you on Facebook still? Or is like Facebook dead to you? Facebook's dead to you. But YouTube, how many of you use YouTube? Do you ever go to YouTube, open up a video, and like 4 hours later realize you're still watching Say Yes to the Dress clips? Okay, right. So the dream of the internet is to channel you into a platform, right? Like Facebook makes it very easy to stay within its ecosystem and not leave it, right? And YouTube delivers you content purposefully that will keep you from leaving. Right? And we'll talk a little bit about what that means for these white supremacist groups, what kind of content tends to be sticky besides cats on the internet, right? So back in these days, the DixieNet folks were trying to figure out how to keep people in their circle, and they were doing it by creating like a ring of links that would let you move around and not stray from the neo-Confederacy online. Their sites really focused on things like independence for white Southerners, talking about how grand the Old South was, those myths you hear about slavery and how people didn't really mind it, right? A lot of that was part of these sites. And they really focused on the grand, old, genteel South, a kind of myth of the South I knew pretty well. There was an effort to kind of connect the South to Celtic origins. So, the South was really just an extension of things that had been going on in Scotland all along. My name's McPherson. My dad loves tartan. He has all the family tartans, right? That League of the South is gone, right? Their website very rarely talked about race. They actually often separated themselves from Klan groups and very consciously said, we're not about race. We just want to protect whiteness, kind of missing that whiteness is a race, right? But really not focused on race. There was often a symbol that had a Klansman with a, like a slash through it to forbid it, right? The new League of the South is not that Dixie net, right? The new League of the South is very overtly racialized and very overtly racist. And they are, interested in a very different kind of image. An image that's militant, an image that's anti-Islamic, an image that's anti-black, an image that is connected to other nationalist organizations like the National Front. So these kind of images are much more common on the site now, when in the past the image would have much more likely been a Southern gentleman, right, captured from. And a lot of political commentary about how the South might need to rise again, right? Might need to secede again. And the group has been identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center now as a hate group nationally, although in the past it probably would not have been identified that way. Trump's presidency helped stoke its membership. As it went more overtly racist, it lost members and then regained that membership many times over after the presidential election. And the website's kind of presence documents that. The website is not really where the action anymore either, right? Because most of us spend a lot less time on standalone websites than we do on the platformed web in a variety of other places. So while Hill maintains the website, and it's pretty frequently updated, his energy as an organizer and a far-right activist moved to platforms, moved to Twitter, moved to Facebook, moved to YouTube, moved to Reddit, right? Places that allowed connection and a movement across each other through hashtags and other ways that was much harder to do in the web of the late 1990s, right? And this move to use online platforms mirrors the strategies of the far right more generally. The Institute for, this was Michael Hill's Twitter page, which was taken down after Charlottesville. But the Institute for Strategic Dialogue has, I don't know why that black box, okay, has interviewed a lot of, has collected the data from Charlottesville and analyzed it pretty extensively to help us understand through a discourse analysis of over 10,000 posts what was kind of motivating the far right to unite in Charlottesville. And they see that most of the calls for violence, the very overt the planning that asked people to bring weapons, to be ready to fight, to think of it as a battle, most of that planning took place on private groups, on Discord and on Facebook, right? And the planning that was public-facing was more benign and focused on, protecting our heritage, but without the calls to bring weapons or to promote violence in the streets, right? So they were organized around a series of topics that really kind of motivated the groups, and different groups that were organized as Nazis or white nationalists had slightly different agendas, but each were very much promoting a notion that whites were under threat in some sort of way, right? And so while the strategies deployed across the different platforms are each slightly different, some more public, some more private, they're not covert like the racism of the 1990s. It's very overt, but it's not the overt racism of the Jim Crow era. As I mentioned before, it's this new kind of emergent racial structure that in the book I'm writing, I'm calling immersive racism. A racism that invites you into its contours and makes you comfortable there. And I'm going to talk a little bit how that might happen. So when Williams talks about structures of feelings, he tells us that the forms are typically nascent. They're like emerging. If you've ever had a chemistry class where you do an experiment to crystallize something out of a solution, you have the thing kind of emerge from the solution and gather together. Williams uses that metaphor to show how structures of feeling can emerge into dominance. He says that they exert a palpable pressure. They really kind of try to become noticeable, right, in ways that I think platforms really help. So if we bring together a notion of shifting racial formations, that the way we understand race in the 21st century is changing from the way we understood it in the late 20th century, with the notion of structures of feelings, we could start to see what digital platforms might be enabling in this mix, how they really support the idea of an immersive racism. So I mean that a platform like Reddit, while you could use it for all sorts of things, right? And I, use Reddit for things, also allows an intense experience of racism. So as you move into subreddits in a variety of ways, you could spend days and weeks and months just soaking up the most violently racist discourse that America has to offer us right now. And we know that Dylan Roof, or the shooter in El Paso, or at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, spent time in these forums, right? So it's a kind of experience of racism that seeps you in it, right? That naturalizes it, that makes it feel normal. And in many cases, repackages being called a racist as a kind of badge of honor. So I'm going to show you a few slides that were released, you could see up at the top, by a group with the fabulous name Unicorn Riot. And Unicorn Riot is a group of hackers who, after Charlottesville, hacked the Discord servers. Does everybody know what Discord is? Who knows? Who doesn't know what Discord? Who does know what Discord is? So Discord is like Skype, right? It's a communications platform that is largely used by who? Who uses Discord? Somebody knows. Gamers. Gamers use Discord, right? My 17-year-old son, like he's playing, a game here. He's got one ear as a headset that's game sound, and the other ear is his Discord headset. And he's chatting with, 3 friends from school who live 10 miles away, and he doesn't know, from all over the country, right? So Discord is like Skype for gamers. That's like an easy way to think of it, right? And Discord was one of the venues because it allows anonymity that a lot of the kind of violent impulses around Charlottesville were planned in. So Unicorn Riot hacks Discord, releases public transcripts of all these private chat groups that were part of the planning. So a lot of the research I'm doing takes advantage of the material that Unicorn Riot has made available, right? So in this particular forum, there's a long discussion going on about whether it matters that we should have an aesthetic, a kind of style to our racism or not, like how we should package it. And there's a debate where certain people are saying, the word aesthetic seems like a wimpy word to me, why are you using it? And somebody else says, do you understand the Third Reich? I mean, the Nazis were all about aesthetics, right? So there's very complicated debates about history and the role of image in how you promote your ideas that are going on in the Discord chat. There's a lot of material that's circulated through the chats with this is the operations kind of forum, and they're planning how to pamphlet campuses to promote far-right ideas, white supremacist ideas on campuses around the country. So this particular poster ended up in most of the women's studies departments at public universities in Southern California. It didn't end up at my private university because you could get arrested at my private university if you show up and pamphlet, right, because it's private property. But the UC campuses are understood to be public property. So the people advising the groups know these legal structures, and they're working to spread the word in ways that, put them at the least risk. Here's some other examples of Vanguard America's kind of propaganda and, the way they're going to kind of forward. They attack professors who teach ethnic studies classes, feminist professors, journalists, and folks who are avowedly kind of left of center online. So what's also happening in these channels are efforts to think about how you might recruit more members, right? So they function kind of like a, Ryan said Amway when we were talking about it earlier, but, or you might say like a cult, right? So once you begin to participate in the groups, in order to get access to more private channels and to higher levels of authority in the group, you're encouraged to bring new members in, right? So the groups produce has anybody ever done fundraising for an organization, like for a radio station or a nonprofit? Did they give you a script to use? And, yeah. So basically they produce these scripts, right? And the scripts start with memes and jokes. And they say, so in your Discord chat, try out some of these memes and jokes. If you get someone who seems receptive to them, here's the language you could use to move them further in. And when you feel like you've vetted them, invite them to this forum. And if you bring enough people to that forum, we'll move you to the next forum, right? So there's a sense that it's a shared mission and that you're working together to kind of bring people into the different spaces and channels. So you start to, you could go deep into a Reddit scroll and really immerse yourself in this space, but then you also emerge from that space and spread the news more horizontally and in other ways. And that's happening, a lot in these different discussions as people are talking about different ways to kind of move the groups forward. They produce a lot of media in their efforts to attract new audience members. This is a very well-produced miniseries that slowly eases you into the idea of Holocaust denial. It might seem harmless, except it's been viewed over 10 million times. It's circulated online and through disc you can order. It has a very wide membership, viewership. It is not, I teach in a film school, it's not easy to make professional-looking media, and this is a fairly sophisticated piece of narrative media, right? So memes and hashtags become really important. They move ideas from a closed space out across media into different spaces. So in the book, I argue that immersive racism, this new form of racism that's emerging in America, operates in both vertical axes, like that Reddit scroll, where you just start reading and 3 hours later you're still way down in there, but also along horizontal axes. And the hashtag is a really good way to move material across a horizontal platform. And we see the kind of movement both deeper and across society in a variety of ways. I think one reason these groups are so successful is because they understand that young people feel isolated, right? That many of the public social spaces that young people may have had access to in the past are less accessible now in an era perhaps of overparenting, right? And that people are looking for social connection. And this kind of jokey meme culture opens up a possibility for that. But this doesn't stay within the platform, right? It moves out of the platform into the streets, into the physical world, often with very violent repercussions, right? So immersive racism doesn't just want to stay in Reddit, where it might be less of a threat, or in the closed, kind of whispering headsets of Discord. It wants to spread itself out into the world. It's not siloed, right? Much of the popular theory on digital media talks about spreadability or viral media as a real positive of digital media, right? That it's able to move and create public participation. Henry Jenkins calls it spreadability, civic participation, right? But I think one of the stakes of that spreadability is how easily these ideas have spread when in the 1990s they could not get traction without the media platforms that exist today. So the platforms are very clearly used for these resources. This is Gab, which is a bit like Twitter, and emerged after Twitter kicked a bunch of Nazis off, and they re-emerged on a new platform that didn't care that they were there. And they definitely understood using the platforms as what they needed to do. So you see here, he says, we're correct, but being correct isn't good enough. We've got to win the infotainment war, right? And that's definitely a way that the platforms understand themselves. So this is a kind of analysis of a growth trajectory of membership in white nationalist groups in the U.S. Across the period from 2012 to 2016. The curve goes up quite a bit from 2016 to the present, right? And J.M. Berger is based at Harvard. He's one of the leading analysts of extremist movements. He also studies Islam, right? And there's some real parallels between how the groups work. One of the things that's very interesting about the spread with platformed media of far-right messaging is that the far right understands the use of the platforms as central to their mission. So one of the most tweeted forms of content from the far right are actually tools that help you manage your social media. So platforms like Crowdfire are ways to manage your Twitter or other accounts for maximum reach, and the right understands themselves to be early adopters of platforms who could use the platforms to their best advantage. But it's not just that the groups are using these platforms, right? What I would argue is that the very designs of the platforms themselves make it possible for the groups to deploy them in the way that they do. So in an ecosystem like Reddit, the messages that surface are the ones that get the most activity, right? And the things that tend to get rewarded with more activity are cynical humor, dark humor, things that Angela Nagel has argued have been really key to the right's ascendancy. The streaming comments really create a space that you feel immersed in. The anonymity of the sites allows trolling and misinformation to spread in a really unchecked way. And the private ownership of platforms, which depend on opaque algorithms that we don't understand the working strategies for, and a climate of real deregulation of our industries, create conditions for the spread of hate and amplify it in a lot of ways. So a platform like YouTube really thrives by reaching what we call network effects. And a network effect is when a platform has increased its scale and user base enough to be able to withstand dips, right? So in the platform's logic, every use of the platform is a good use, right? Regardless of content, using the platform is what helps a platform achieve a network effect. So the business model wants to collect as much data as possible and extract monetary value from that data. So trying to regulate the use of the platform contradicts the platform's core business model, right? So the platforms are not at all incentivized to see themselves as needing to limit use that is violent or use that undermines democracy. Actually, their architecture and algorithms privilege dark content. So if you spend much time on YouTube, starting with a very benign search, you'll very quickly end up in darker content, right? Because what YouTube most wants is you not to leave, right? Because they're making money from mining your choices and from you being on the platform, seeing ads, right? So the more extreme content they serve you, the more you stay, right? And the more valuable that is to the system. So it's not just that users post racist things, but that racist things help sustain the platform. It helps the platform really achieve its profitability, right? So proliferating hate is a business incentive for the platforms. There's very little to encourage them to really stop that practice. So platforms for digital media theorists might be understood to be multiply articulated, which is a fancy way of saying they're articulated to many different streams, to users, but also to tracking, right? And they create publics, but they also create publics that learn how to use the platform, right? So Tarleton Gillespie says that platforms calculate, but so do their publics. They're calculated and calculating, right, in a variety of ways. And they so easily serve these new forms of racism because that kind of content circulates very well. So they're very deeply intertwined, right? So this is, an example of one of the more kind of radical political groups thinking about how you could use Discord, right? So understanding early on that Discord was going to be a good venue for the far right to kind of grow and organize and spread its messages. The League of the South might seem, kind of irrelevant in the face of all of these other groups, but what's allowed to the League of the South by these platforms is their articulation to very different far-right groups. And the call to unite the right, which was what the rally was called in Charlottesville, is a call to bring these groups together across their difference, right? And really allow them to kind of work together in a variety of ways. So, here's Michael Hill with the Nationalist Front in Tennessee, a group that would not have been part of his mindset 20 years ago. But platforms have allowed their connection in very real ways. And the notion that, we need to get over our differences and unite, amen, brother, is very much the kind of space that the group is organizing around. Raymond Williams, who I've mentioned several times, who came up with that idea of structures of feelings. These are hate groups in the U.S. This is an older chart. There are more of them now, but it just kind of gives you a sense of the spread. Utah doesn't look too bad compared to, Southern California. Like, look at L.A., right? But Raymond Williams wasn't hopeless. Like, I think sometimes doing this research, it's easy to be hopeless because if I spend, an afternoon reading a Reddit forum about the best way to kill feminists, would it be to drop them out of a helicopter onto the ground or into the ocean? That could get kind of demoralizing after a while. Like, it's heavy stuff to read. But Raymond Williams understood that an idea that's struggling to come into dominance hasn't won, right? And that it's not fixed, that we could change things, right? That action in the present could produce a different outcome, right? So I think what we're charged with now as scholars, but also in a city like LA as media makers, but more broadly as citizens of a democracy who might want to hold on to democratic structures, is to figure out what different kinds of media formats might look like that could intervene in this emergent structure of feeling, stymie it, turn it differently. So one of my favorites is a YouTube channel called ContraPoints, which takes up a lot of far-right talking points and, pretty campily eviscerates them, right? But this is probably not the best format for everybody. So what we're doing at USC now is organizing a working group that is going to start working primarily with students to produce counter media and think about how that media will circulate online and elsewhere. I think what I've also recognized from the kind of incursion, I've given a version of this talk in many places over the last year, and I've yet to give it in a place with a large audience of grown-ups, of like parents, where someone hasn't come up to me afterward and said, they've gotten my son, right? So it's real and it's out there, right? And I think parents in particular have a responsibility to have pretty hard conversations about race in America with their children from early on to really make it less easy to take a 14-year-old boy and pull him deep into the dark, dark web. So thank you.
We've got some time for questions and discussion.
Yeah.
How do you think you can better avoid them?
I think that we need to understand better how platforms work and have different ways of intervening in them. So one is to produce different media and work the same algorithms that the far right works to circulate that media to different audiences. So that is a thing. ContraPoint is, thank you. ContraPoint is just a person, right, who decided to make this media. And, here's an incel video with 2 million views, right? It wasn't really 6 months ago because this slide was from the spring. But, 10 months ago, it probably has 3 million views now, right? So, this is one strategy, right, to produce counter media. Another, I think, is not to stay polite and refuse to challenge ideas that we hear in public, because the right will not, stay quiet, right? So I think we have to be bold and to speak up. I think there are changes in education we could think about, right? But I also think, and this is hard to imagine in America right now, we could regulate media in ways we always have historically, right? And, I travel to internationally to talk about this work because the rise of the far right is an international movement. In Canada, in Germany, in Sweden, in Norway, none of these videos that I've shown, the early videos I showed, will play in those countries, right? And they're on YouTube. YouTube is not the same YouTube in Germany as it is here, right? And it's because Germany, having lived through the Holocaust, has pretty clear anti-hate speech laws, right? And that is not, free speech is not a binary. It's like you either have free speech or you don't have free speech. Free speech is a continuum, and we already treat it that way, right? So you don't have free speech to libel somebody. You suffer consequences. You don't have free speech to stand up in a movie theater and shout fire. That's illegal, right? You don't have free speech to put porn on, children's TV stations on broadcast at 4 p.m., right? There are millions of ways we regulate media. And YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, those are media companies, right? So there's lots of precedent for how we can deal with hate speech in those environments, right? So we probably don't have the political will to do that at a national level in America right now, but that's not to say we never will. And we have had, I'm a media historian. We have regulated media since its emergence in America, right? And the Constitution does not enshrine all free speech of all kinds forever. People should maybe actually read the Constitution and see how narrowly free speech is actually defined there, right? So I don't think there's one answer. I think we could work in a lot of different ways to try to counter this. And did you have a question here?
It was the same as hers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. You mentioned speaking up. Could you talk a little bit about allyship and how that looks? Because there's different types of speaking up.
Right. And I think it's especially important for white folks to speak up, right? And not assume that people of color who are most frequently attacked by the far right would be the people to speak back to far right ideology, right? I think, my first book, I come from a Southern working class family. My parents were very working class. They were the first in their families to go to college. They grew up in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. My parents are pretty progressive. My dad went on to be a college professor, but none of their siblings or cousins or extended family are left or center. They're all quite far right? And I've always been very interested in why my parents, at the moment of civil rights, took a turn to be different kinds of people than they had grown up to be, right? And that's a hard thing to do, to grow up with a set of beliefs and figure out in learning history that maybe that set of beliefs is inaccurate and find your way to a new set, right? And I think one thing allies could do is take responsibility for learning that history. For me, that meant in school a lot of both listening and reading the work produced particularly by African American feminist scholars to really sort of understand a point of view that I had grown up with, even with more liberal parents in the South, never understanding, right? Gone with the Wind was on like endless loop in the South when I was growing up. You know, it was a movie we just watched over and over again, right? And really learning to understand what that movie didn't tell us, right? You know, taking responsibility for learning those things is a really important first step for allies, to listen to people and to hear their experiences as valid, and then to do the work, right? To stand up and say, you know, this is not okay with me either, and this is what I'm going to do about it.
I'm curious, I'm not sure how much this has to do with specifically what you were talking about, but it's made me wonder why so few, particularly white Americans, have any idea about their Union heritage, right? Like so many Southern folks have, like, they can tell you exactly who in their lineage like, fought in what battle for the South, and so few white Northern Americans especially can say that about their Union forefathers and mothers probably. And I'm wondering if you think that has, one, if that has to do with this idea that we kind of, in the 80s and 90s, said, poof, racism is gone, we don't talk like that anymore, so we didn't really feel a need to learn that history. And if that would be helpful, or is living in the past not the way to battle these ideas?
I mean, I think understanding what we do and don't know about the past is helpful. Like understanding why in the United States the Civil War is always framed as a site of like almost like melancholy and nostalgia, right? It was a thing, this great battle of brother against brother, right? And you know that's not the way most countries who've survived the Civil War narrate what happened, right? And the reason, you know, it has a lot to do with the reconciliation of the South to the nation in Reconstruction and after, and the way African Americans who were newly freed were sold out by the nation in order to bring the South back into the fold, right? And we don't tell that history, and not telling that history or telling, you know, Texas controls the textbook market for public education in America because they're an enormously large state. And what Texas kind of wants in their textbooks dictates in many ways what will show up in, you know, your textbook in Missouri or Oregon, right? And those textbooks don't grapple with slavery or its legacies. They don't grapple with Reconstruction and what happened after it. You know, so you know, I'm pretty well educated, and I was in graduate school before I understood how normal lynching was in the 1920s, right? And that Americans went to lynching events like a parade, right? And that postcards were sold and picnics happened, right? And this is all well documented. It was written up in newspapers, you know, all over the country, right? It happened primarily in the South, but not only in the South. But what does it mean if we don't teach that history, right? If people don't know it, right? So I don't know if did you learn that in high school? It's like a history that's forgotten, right? So we have to grapple with the past, you know, like Faulkner said, it's not even past, right? So if we don't acknowledge it, right, and it's hard and it's messy and, you know, it feels like a long time ago. Like, why should I worry about slavery? I don't own a slave, right? Nobody I knew, you know, none of my relatives owned a slave, right? But, you know, America's wealth was built on slavery. Well, you know, the video we watched early on said white people built America. You know, they didn't, right? So, you know, it was stolen labor that built America and built America's wealth.
I mean, just as a follow-up to that, I mean, over the summer and last year, I decided, well, I should probably look up what my family history was with the Civil War, and was physically sick waiting to figure out, like, which side did we fight on. So it's also like the guilt thing that we've got to figure out how to get over.
I agree. Guilt is one of the things I write quite a bit about in Reconstructing Dixie, because in trying to understand white people become less racist, like how they change, right, you have to learn to not linger in guilt, because guilt can become a kind of end point, right? So you feel guilty and you just stay there, and it immobilizes you and keeps you from moving forward. right? So thinking about how to process guilt and not get stuck in it, and we don't have good models for that. Like, we don't have very many examples of white people who learn to think differently, right? If those were the, people we celebrated historically, it would give us a different set of pathways. Yeah.
Do you think avoidance of guilt could be something that drives some people into racism?
I think it could be, or anger about guilt. Like, why are you trying to make me feel that way?
It gives them a way not to feel guilty. You
Yeah.
don't have to join us, and you don't have to feel guilty. You can feel pride instead.
And I think, it's not hard to understand why, particularly folks who don't feel like their lives have taken the trajectory they thought was promised to them, particularly as white men, right? That like my grandfather went to, didn't finish high school, went to, worked at the Exxon refinery, died of, all kinds of cancer from cleaning oil vats his whole life at 62. The other grandfather was a coal miner who died of black lung at 57, right? But each of them almost lived a middle-class life because they had strong, industrial jobs that after World War II paid a living wage. And that, even if they didn't have cultural status, they had economic stability that lifted their children into an educated class, right? So that pathway is gone in America, right? The kind of gap between the very wealthy and everybody else is so rapidly expanding that I think it's probably easier to blame that on anybody but the people you elected, right? than to move in some other direction. Yeah, I think it's another way to deal with the guilt is just to get really mad, right? Yeah. If you haven't checked out ContraPoints, go and watch it.
I'm going to, it's on my phone.
Yeah.
Our discussion earlier.
I mean, do other people have good?
Oh, I was just going to ask because I think that it's so fascinating the way you've shown how some of the sort of not always well-known logics of these platforms are incentivizing these kinds of content. So I guess I was just curious if there are other aspects of how platforms work that you think most people don't necessarily know about, or that we all as a society need to be more educated about, like just more about sort of, when you say we need to understand how these platforms work, besides the fact that darker content is sticky, what are more of the kinds of things that we need to know about how these platforms work in order to fight back against?
Yeah, I mean, I think not just related to this kind of content, but to our lives, is how much the platforms are harvesting data from you right now, right? So data is cheap to store now, and platforms see themselves as building what you might think of, it's not so much as clouds, but like data lakes that are just really deep and pervasive. And they want to just collect as much data of your use patterns and choices and preferences, not only about you in particular, but about patterns that emerge, right? And it's easy in some ways to think of that as benign, but the traces to you stay. And it's not hard to imagine that searches or certain things you look up at particular times in a not too distant future could be used to deny you insurance coverage, right? We're really close to that already, right? That if you're having some weird symptoms and you're looking things up and you get tagged to that, and down the road, insurance companies really want that data, right? And they're maneuvering in many ways to get it, right? So those are just like very immediate consequences to what happens when every choice you've made online is, and I know this, I teach it, I'm teaching a digital media seminar right now where we're looking at waste and labor and algorithms and code and what is in my hand all day, right? Like just all day, right? So much data I just give it away, right? And I know better, right? So thinking about what in the platforms really propels a kind of addiction, right? My 17-year-old would be sitting right here in the front, kind of into video games, right? But he kind of is, right? And I'm kind of addicted to, whatever thing I'm doing, like old people's Facebook, right? There's a dopamine rush that comes from being, involved in the spaces, and we don't understand what that's doing to us, right? But you can believe the corporations are studying how they produce that hit, right? They're very invested at university campuses like mine right now, and having neuroscientists help them understand how to keep you from going away, right? That's, they're funding research at universities absolutely designed to figure out how to just hit your pleasure center over and over and over and over and over again, right?
So is that kind of why, so like on Twitter, they have like that like a rule that's like anti-hate speech and all that. But would that be why they don't necessarily enforce it as much, because it actually provides them more?
It provides them more data and more use, right? And to be monetized to their shareholders, they have to show increased use always. And that's, they've hit a place where it's hard to keep, increasing use, right? So anything that would affect use, they have no incentive to do that, right?
Especially probably because like when somebody tweets something that's maybe racist or something, a lot of people interact with that tweet.
Yeah, yeah. And, both good and bad. Like, so I'm for it saying, look at this racism, right? And other people are for it, so, it creates a kind of snowballing effect that, increases eyes to the platform, right? And it's hard to think about how you break those cycles, right? And the far right has done a really good job of using that binary notion of free speech to also scare the platforms from doing anything, right? Because they don't want to get accused of censoring, right? Because it's America, right? And free speech, right? But I think there are ways those companies could be convinced to shift their algorithms to promote other kinds of material in ways that are harder to kind of see as censorship. One of the other problems is that algorithms are treated as intellectual property, right? And companies develop algorithms that, totally shape what your search results are, or what will stream to you next, or what will be connected, right? But those algorithms do a lot of other things in culture too, right? So corporations have produced algorithmic software that every insurance company in America uses to decide whether or not they should fund your surgery, right? So, what they're running is not, will this save you? What they're running is, if we deny this person and get sued, would that cost us more or less than, if we, fund the surgery or not, right? Predictive sentencing and parole software uses algorithms in similar ways. So companies build software packages that they don't have to reveal how the algorithm works. And a parole board uses that software package with about 8 variables plugged in to decide whether or not they'll grant parole to somebody coming up for parole. And the lawyer working with the person in prison up for parole doesn't know what the algorithm variables are. So there's no way, like in the past, when somebody might have brought witnesses or extra evidence, when you rely on an opaque algorithm to make a decision like that, there's no way to understand what you're fighting against, right? And those systems have been shown very clearly to be racially biased, just as our justice system often is, right? And they'll use things like your home neighborhood to predict whether or not you might create a new crime, right? Or if you had what education you had. So things that are really shouldn't be quantified and should be understood more holistically. It turned into an algorithmic process, right?
So we kind of encourage people, to speak up whenever they see racism online. And I just was wondering, there's a lot of moments when people do speak up. Do you think that there's a certain point, though, that we sometimes overdo our voices in certain situations, like with the Carson King situation that's going on right now, where people dig certain things up and they try to make a deal and cancel people out of.
I would prefer we could create a world with greater degrees of empathy. I'm sympathetic to some of the critiques of cancel culture, but I also know people who are scholars on the left, particularly women of color, who have their financial information released online, or who have a SWAT team called to their house, right? And people die, right? And that, if you're weighing, some of the bad effects of cancel culture versus physical violence in the world against people who speak out, right? It's complicated, but I think more kindness is a good thing, but I'm not sure it's always the path that's going to be the thing we need in a moment, right? So the whole, aspects of cancel culture I think can be really toxic, and a lot of left activists are talking about that in their communities, I think. But I think it's also been produced like free speech as a binary kind of problem, that it is or it isn't this, and it's a continuum of practices, and how we might understand them, I think, is really nuanced and complicated.
Yeah. Couldn't critiques of cancel culture, though, also be a way to deflect against the original argument of why we cancel?
Yeah. I think they're often not in good faith, right? But sometimes they are. I think. I think there's a pretty. I really like Adrienne Marie Brown's writing. Her book Emergent Strategies, her new book on pleasure and activism, and I think in her work in Detroit, she's really trying to think about how we move from pleasure rather than, and how important it is to hold on to joy and pleasure as activists so you don't burn out and sort of run out of kind of energy and steam. And I think there's a lot of good lessons for me in her work to how to think about more generative, she uses the notion of emergence, and also a kind of emergent kindness or holding on to joy in those kind of spaces. So, and which is hard. In certain moments when you're doing organizing activist work, it's hard to remember joy, right? So.
Could you repeat her name again?
Adrienne Marie Brown. She's got a great Instagram and nice Twitter. She's the first book is Emergent Strategies. The second book has pleasure in the title, and because I read that one on my iPad, I can't visualize the cover, right? So, which is the problem of reading on your iPad. Is you forget who wrote the book. It's called what?
Pleasure activism.
Pleasure. So I knew those words were in there somewhere. Her work teaches really well too.
Well, we invite you all to join us in the Library Room 101 for a brief reception after this. We'll be adjourning here and heading over there at 4:30. We have about 10 minutes to do whatever it is you do when you're not in the classroom. And we'll see you over there. So just join me one more time in thanking Tara McPherson for thank you all for coming.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so hard to do it.
Yes, thank you. No, I kind of like the way
And you should have seen those like things I forgot to see. Turn on the other.
Would you mind picking up what this, the description that way when they go looking for this? I will. That's our new reception in a.
All right.
A bit late.
Okay.
All
right, I'll try to help you track it down. But yep. You can probably edit it. Kind of do something cool where we get kind of a couple different angles and stuff. That would be awesome. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this, especially at the last minute when media production conked out on me. I think we're going to try to do. So that's awesome.
And you can teach the students. So
Yeah.
I just saw,
internships.
yeah, like she was at USC.
Yeah. Because then you hired me. Should wait. Great. Yeah.
Observation. No, I took a picture. It's like a picture of her thumb. I'm like, oh, please don't make me. I opened a print. Like, your hands on the ground.
Your meeting has ended.